Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the next episode of Dilated Peoples of the Caribbean. Hope you enjoyed the first episode. Here, we're going to be sort of moving on now. Around about the 1500 year mark, you've got first encounters of the Europeans coming back in their droves. They're looking to obviously make contact and see if they can get a foothold in the Caribbean. Obviously, in their way would be the local indigenous. We're going to sort of touch on the three tribes that we're going to focus on. Obviously, we're going to go into where they first set foot in the Caribbean and tried to get a foothold, which would be Hispaniola, or modern day you would know as the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And just before we go on, you've got the Commonwealth of Dominica, or in its shorter form, Dominica, which is the island that half my family comes from or originates from in the Caribbean. And then you've got in the Spanish Caribbean, Dominican Republic, which is more well known in America. They've got quite a large population in New York and whatever else, and they've got a population here in South London. Obviously, we are of similar or of the same diaspora in the Caribbean, I'd like to say. But obviously, this is more focused on their island, there in Haiti, because that was the first place that the Europeans officially set up their first colony, which was Spain, yeah? And basically, you just want to sort of touch on that and introduce you to that and delve into what it may have been like back then, and just give a couple of thoughts and opinions really along the way. Anyway, let's start off. Tribes of the Caribbean will have nuances in linguistics, rituals, and spiritual idols set over thousands of years in relative isolation. Moreover, closer to recent times, there seems to be three surviving and thriving tribes of the Caribbean that, albeit would have suffered population devourment, but managed to override primary contact with their ancestors whom they'd been evolutionarily thousands of years removed from. First, there is the Taino, then the Kalinago, and finally the focus will be set upon the Segueyo. The Taino, simply known in Jamaica as the Arawak, are the direct descendants of the first peoples to inhabit the island chain and had the red carpet privilege of being the premier host to maiden voyages of first European encounters. The reports came back as stellar and cannot be denied. The societally uninterrupted welcoming party were receptive to those that would have appeared alien. The Taino, to their cultural universal credit detriment, would become known for acting the more interactive, hospitable, and receptive among antique tribes of the Caribbean. At this stage, the initial expeditions reportedly confirmed the Taino performing agricultural practices and were seen in maintenance of a civilized farming culture, as would have been depicted by the ill-educated view to their way of life Eurocentric concept of societal order. The Taino had an extremely organized social order whereby the chief was known as cacique. Shortly after initial contact, upon entering the 17th century, the Taino were to be existentially tested as a bloodline. Early pleasant exchange alongside pastures of cultural background was soon to be replaced with the greatest threat to their civilizational structure. The Europeans began revisiting expeditions to the Caribbean in greater numbers, as Europe, akin to a newborn baby exposed naked to shining ultraviolet rays of uncharted Mother Earth, was at the beginning phase of formulating a pathway to compartmentalize the blinding fresh colours of the New World rainbow. What absolutely must have started as a quest for a sniff of historical oral East Indian spice and swashbuckling adventure was to be swamped by the snowballing stench of global colonization and conflation of the battering economics of the industrial age at its pre-embryonic stage, with little idea of what the next few hundred years had in store, as European mercantilism outpaces missionary mercy and universally masters the seven seas. By the early 1500s, European seacraft used superior sea navigation to begin docking ashore throughout the Caribbean, which paved the way to what would become the biggest threat to existence for the whole indigenous tribal order of the Americas. It was estimated at the time the natives in the geographical vicinity suffered catastrophic casualties upon contact due to low-level immunity of First World virality. The Europeans brought with them not just cultural, but a biological exchange that literally declared chemical warfare against the unexposed natives. The Europeans, preset with a man-made mindset programmed for trade, quickly assessed the bountiful landscape of the first soon-to-be European outpost in Hispaniola, modern-day Dominican Republic and Haiti. Preempting their visitors were going to outstay their welcoming party, the proud Taino began with adverse effect to resist the advances of a mankind that shared no will for their way of life and spirituality. Pretty much no sooner had the European boatmen secured a foothold, the business of labour intensity and promising equivalency of middle-aged millionaire affluence signposted the first days of slavery as the devil of European empowerment, void of racism, exercised its manipulation flow by monetary manifestation, fashioned for material wishes, was to ignite the chariot of hellfire upon the indigenous. Converted by force into adoption as the first children of imperialism, a new life for the subjugated meant dwelling near their captors. This Trojan era of doomsday consequence inadvertently sped up the evolution of catastrophe as the Taino immune system is subjected to alchemy overload of 4,000 years worth of biological upgrades spun on a simultaneous axis. Many would succumb to measles and smallpox. It's estimated between 70 to 85% of the indigenous population were made perishable chattel, as they were afforded little protection by the vaccine of nature against the sweeping tide of the first world disease from the overpopulated by regulatory nature of Eastern Hemisphere. As the Europeans began to settle the islands of the Caribbean, another Darwinist experimentation proving evolution was soon to reach its finite inevitability as a heavyweight versus strawweight clash of civilizations was fast approaching the meeting of its first bell of significance under the spectatorship of viewership unknown to man. The indigenous, facing a verging threat to their world as they had little chance of standing up to a force 4,000 years removed from originality. This period ended in the Europeans out of the starting blocks, placing the natives under seed of subjugated chattel. The Taino, predestined to become amongst the first forced employees to trial what would go on to become the transatlantic slave trade. Right, so the Europeans have landed, they've arrived. They surveyed the place in 1492, I believe, 1493. And then obviously they've started to come back in their droves and begin to sort of get a foothold across the island chain. But obviously they've targeted Hispaniola, which is modern-day Dominican Republic and Haiti, as a place to sort of colonize, first. And it does eventually become the first official colony of the Americas for the Europeans, in the game of colonization. And, the Taino obviously within days take exception. However, disease is rife. The Europeans bring with them New World disease, which is obviously nowhere near them. They've never had that. So, basically 4,000 years worth of all type of diseases that Europeans have had to fight against via cultural exchange. Yeah, right. Or social exchange, you might want to call it. Yeah, they haven't been exposed to that. They're unexposed, if you know what I mean. So, that ripped through their order, it ripped through their, population. you could say up to 70-80% wiped out within sort of 10 to 20 years, which will go on about anyway. Real devastation. And it would have took the Europeans longer potentially to colonize, because they lost 3 out of 4 people, just by the Europeans being there, But pretty much no sooner had the Europeans been there, they introduced the system of working, or you could say slavery. Some Taino took advantage, took exception to it. Obviously, it's their land. They didn't trust them. They didn't want them there. Pretty much, as soon as the Europeans landed there, within like days, weeks, they wanted them gone, and something was going to happen. So basically, that's where we're at right now. The natives aren't happy, but there's nothing they can do about it. The Europeans are coming back with their firepower and their weaponry and their new world technology, and there's nothing they can do about it. They're getting flooded, with like migration, basically, yeah. So the Dominicans decide to obviously try and stand up for themselves, but we'll go further with this in the next section. Crisis of society seldom goes without resistance. The Taino would soon grow weary of the new economic migrants as novelty ran its course. There were attempts of few spirited uprisings, most notably the tale of Enriquillo. Enriquillo must go down as the most inspirational freedom fighter of the past half a millennium that must be the stuff of Hollywood movie epic. Son of a murdered father, husband to a ravaged wife, and one of the last Dominican royals, Enriquillo decides to meet the world's first superpower, Spain, head to head. Enriquillo leaves his position of subordination and retakes the mantle. Together with the remains of a decimated Taino, Enriquillo spearheads a rearguard of epic proportions. With superior knowledge of the terrain, the Spanish have the fear of God exacted against them. For all the Taino who managed to escape shackles and reach the mountains was enough men for existence to be maintained whilst launching a fierce military guerrilla war campaign that had the Spanish settlers feeling the voodoo spirit of the Caribbean was going to render their ill-equipped spirits ghosted. For years, the Taino offensive managed to outmaneuver its much larger adversary. Their primary tactic was that of the cunning. Dawn raids, planned ambushes, and carefully selected grounds of battle saw the Taino on a regular basis, causing significant casualties and disruption to the Spanish industrial war machine on the island that even Spanish reinforcements could not quell the buoyancy of, as a minute tribe were holding their own. What would have served as mirrored between a thorn in the side and a real threat to development of the first colony of the Americas was a clear endangerment to trade ambitions, and must have wreaked havoc back in Europe within the halls of supremacy, as the elites from Britain, Holland, France, and right on the heels of the Spanish conquests were limbering up for new world GDP scramble. In what would be, in today's world, beyond a moral victory, the Spanish grew weary of tit-for-tat warfare in the Sierra Bojoroco mountains and succumbed to fear of submission that it was damaging their aspirations of what was potentially being expected from pioneers of Central Powers that possessed no real military equal. The Spanish had no choice and were forced to enter a plea bargaining for parley with the Taino chiefs. The Taino managed to manipulate the devious European pen of ratified law and codify agreement. Genuine articles that signified the first of many human rights struggles alongside the one-drop black African chant for emancipation that was to be the struggle of the next 300 years. Enriquillo, being educated in his youth by the first Spanish missionaries, would have surely meant he was presumably skilled in matters of basic literacy, which would in turn open pathways to a deeper understanding of an enemy that respects its own solitary. The stubborn resistance the Taino managed to fortify banked Enriquillo the position of high-stakes roller at the bargaining table. After years of battling for sovereignty, this remote tribe managed to secure the greatest victory. From being blindsided by the first world concepts pertaining to greed and hustling, the Spanish boatmen were made to plead for the table of amendment. Under methods of modern virality, news of mighty Spain taking a clear backward step whilst on conquest to civilise and plunder must have sent shockwaves back through the Atlantic waves that outstruck the hearts of the vain within the Castilian hierarchical order. Upon this multiplication, news of Spain experiencing troubles would have been envisaged as weakness on the political frontiers, possibly sufficing to culminate a source of authoritarian embarrassment. Retrospectively, events of indigenous uprisings are now fairly depicted as unapologetically shameful from fateful European perspectives that in some guilt-driven cases despise their own reflection. However, this horrendous chapter still offers the prison sentence of being labelled close to history's worst by many typecast pastime actors. On the other hand, Enriquillo sits as a Dominican source of national pride that will never be forgotten by the footnotes of history. A peace treaty with Spain came to fruition. For a short period, around the 1530s, the Taino secured freedom. Pale in significance, recapturing of land had been contested and won. One must accept that practices such as freedom allowances were extremely threatening to the domineering atmosphere, which is the psychological hydration that quenches the blood money thirst for control of the burgeoning lucrative trade triangle. It's a clear indication that to maintain balance on the island, the Taino had to have been appeased, as the translucent picture would take priority and ample time for meeting the exponential quota on demand that mustered tantamount to evoking the devil out of the presupposed saintly. Right, so that was the story of Enriquillo or Enriquillo. I don't know. I can't speak. Right, but absolute national hero of the Dominican Republic, Hispaniola, and obviously the wider Caribbean. He was taken in as a slave, was a royal, was a Dominican royal, original royal. He was taken in as a slave by the Spanish, but then also taught by the missionaries, and he would obviously been able to speak their language, learn how to read, write, and whatever else. But then, he decided to resist being colonized, and went back with his people. They went back to the mountains, and they tried to obviously face up to the Spanish conquest, and they done their best, even though they would have lost many, many men, and eventually they got some type of agreement put in place where they got a little bit of their land back when it's all theirs really, and he sits as like a Dominican hero. I believe there's a nice statue of him in Santo Domingo somewhere, and he's a real hero, and it's a Hollywood movie in the making, like the Gladiator. It's along those lines from what I've been reading, and it would be a nice story to see as an epic in Hollywood. I doubt they would do something like that, but to me, he's the first national hero of the Caribbean. He's the first resistance fighter, if that's what you want to call it, of the Caribbean, and it stands for something, and it can never ever be forgotten, so kudos to Enriquillo, and real hero, cannot be forgotten, must be held up aloft, he set the tone and showed, what it was to be resistant, and it's a fantastic story when you read into it, when you go into it. But Hats off to the Dominican, you know what I mean, the last royal Dominican hero, do you know what I mean, or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, big story. And yeah, like I'm feeling quite emotional now as I'm speaking. I won't go any further, but yeah, yeah, big up and hats off and respect and kudos and love to the cacique, Enriquillo. All right. So that brings this episode to a conclusion. I hope you've enjoyed it. I have towards the back end. So we've seen now that the Europeans have flooded the Caribbean. They've got a stronghold. They've whittled down the natives. They're at their last ebb, but they realise they recover a little bit and get a little bit back for themselves. But obviously they're to be taken away. That's to be taken away by the transatlantic slave movement. They were actually potentially the first slaves of the Caribbean that were forced. And then obviously they went and got African manpower, which we're going to obviously go into later in the series, yeah. But yeah, the natives of the Caribbean were the first to really get be abused, you know. And you know, they often go like without being noticed. When I feel like part of the African story or part of like a black story in the Caribbean needs to notice these guys alongside you, even though there's much less of them, you know, because it is originally their place. You can't take that away from them, yeah. And yeah, obviously this was when, you know, the idea came about to or this is when like they were going to kick into gear with the industrial age coming up, mercantilism, which was like European expansion and turned into sort of colonialism, etc. We'll go into, but just nice to get a good foundation anyway, just like of what went on in the Caribbean with the European encounters, you know. And obviously the Europeans, you know, back then there was no such word as like racism or whatever and all the rest of it. They were just like, they had a system, a structure where it was all about achievement, money, achieving conquest for your queen and country or king and country, etc., and just objectives, you know. So it was ruthless to whatever culture was there, but sometimes it wasn't from a racist place. It was just what it was back then, you know. But anyway, I hope this message reaches you well. Next, we're going to cover the Kalinago, formerly the Caribs of the Caribbean, which are they're on the sort of the Windward, from like the Windward Islands of the Lesser Antilles, you might want to say, and they are going to be spoken about a little bit more in depth. We're going to touch on them and their struggle as well in the next episode, which I'm hoping that you'll watch. Anyway, deliver this message straight to your heart because it's from mine. All right, bless, love, one.